Hey there, this is Phillip M. Bailey, host of States of America, where we're having a post-debate analysis about the final conversation between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden with our very own Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief, who also spoke with the Democracy Fund about the changing demographics of voters in our country. We're going to be talking with Natalie Allison, politics reporter with the Tennessean, about how big orange politics has been affected in the Trump era, a question from a voter about LGBTQ rights and what it means both under President Trump and possibly under a President Joe Biden. Let's go. So, Susan, for me, I guess the first thing that I noticed in this debate was that President Trump certainly maybe took advice from his campaign and didn't do a lot of interruptions, at least in the first 30 minutes. Did you notice that?
You know, it's remarkable how much impact a mute button seems to have. Because you found the president, especially in the first half of the debate, being quite courteous about abiding by the rules, speaking for 2 minutes and letting Joe Biden speak for 2 minutes uninterrupted. The debate got a little more hurly-burly as the evening went on, but it was much more a traditional presidential debate in contrast to that first presidential debate this year that was really such a train wreck.
Right. Shout out to Kristen Welk of NBC News. I guess the other thing that I noticed was that instead of interruptions, the president seemed to be a lot more personal, trying to bring in Hunter Biden. What I thought, though, was that he was really speaking to the base on that, right? He didn't really explain the details of the controversy that I don't think the average American voter may even understand or know about. Sort of went right into the meat and sort of the thick of that conversation or that controversy. Did the former vice president do a good job of defending his son, defending himself against these claims? You know,
it was interesting. You actually saw Joe Biden be the one who alluded first to the Hunter Biden controversy. It was no surprise that President Trump intended to bring that up, and yes, he did prosecute it in a serious way. The vice president did respond to it. He denied accusations of unethical misconduct. He denied that he had ever received any money from any foreign entity, and he tried to turn it around on Trump by saying, New York Times has reported you had a bank account in China, that you paid more in taxes to China than you did in federal income taxes to the United States in recent years. So I think that both candidates did what they thought they needed to do on that issue.
The president did make a couple of statements, Susan, that were just flatly untrue. One of the more interesting things, made some predictions I thought also were sort of surprising when he said that we're going to regain the majority, Republicans are going to regain the majority in the House. I think most prognosticators actually indicate that the Democrats are going to expand their majority by maybe 5 or maybe up to 15 seats. What was one of the more dubious claims, fact checks you saw either from the president or maybe even from former Vice President Joe Biden, the fact checkers are going to be alarmed about?
You know, the misstatements and the untruths that President Trump said are pretty familiar. There's things he's been saying on the stump about whether he will protect pre-existing coverage for people with pre-existing conditions if the Affordable Care Act goes down, or what the record of the Obama-Biden administration was on the treatment of migrants at the border. A series of familiar statements, ones that he's been called on in the past. You know, I think he came in with an agenda of behaving a little better. I think that the behavior that he showed at the first debate put voters off. We know that because we saw him dip in the polls. If there are reluctant Trump voters who were looking for a reason to get back in his camp, he probably gave them that tonight, not by his statement on issues, but by his personal behavior.
Right. I think not interrupting the former vice president, but also interesting to me, Susan, that the president, when the conversation was about the coronavirus, sort of giving this methodical presentation of, look, we all can't be in our basements and sort of hide. We have to sort of get moving, get working again. Do you think that kind of gave some folks who are looking for some sort of hopeful conversation around the coronavirus rather than this sort of all or nothing? Either we're all out there not wearing masks, doing whatever we want, or being locked in or sheltered in place. Did the president sort of give a pathway for those undecided moderate voters who are like, yeah, I can't be in my home all day. I got to get out and work. I got to pay bills. Did he give them a pathway to vote for him?
Well, he may have, because, of course, it is a balancing act, right, between being as safe as we can be in terms of our health, but also having an economy that's working, letting having adults be able to go back to work, having kids be able to go back to school. That's definitely the subject of some considerable debate. But I did think that Vice President Biden once again came across as someone who kind of felt the nation's pain when it comes to COVID-19. You know, there were several points where Joe Biden spoke directly to the camera, said, I'm thinking about you sitting around your kitchen table at home,
Right.
worrying about the chair that's empty where the person who has died from COVID-19 used to sit, worried about your health care coverage if you've lost your job. I thought those were the most effective moments from Biden's point of view. And he really took advantage of having the closing minute in those final questions to talk directly to voters about what he would say to those who do not support him at his inauguration. Here's what I would say to you. He said, I'll be the president of all Americans.
Kristen Welker, I think, is the first African-American woman to moderate a presidential debate, not a vice presidential debate like Will Eiffel and Ms. Simpson years ago before her. She brought up the issue of race relations, which I thought was really interesting in this aspect. Susan, I want to get your thoughts on this. The president sort of being aggressive with the vice president, saying, look at your record, the crime bill, and then saying, I'm the least racist person in the room. No president's been better for African Americans since Abraham Lincoln, who, when he was president, by the way, that was the end of slavery. Right? A pretty bold statement there. But, you know, Joe Biden's record obviously is not without blemishes. He, again, apologized for his role in the 1994 crime bill.
I'm the least racist person in this room.
Okay, Vice President Biden, let me ask you very quickly, and then I have a follow-up question for you.
Abraham Lincoln here is one of the most racist presidents we've had in modern history. He pours fuel on every single racist fire, every single one. He started off his campaign coming down the escalator saying he's going to get rid of those Mexican rapists. He's banned Muslims.
Well, President Trump has very low appeal among African-American voters. We know that from the polling, especially African-American women, but even among African-American men, he's in the single digits. I think that sometimes when he talks about his commitment to racial justice, it's really a signal to white voters who who care a lot about racism and fighting racism and want to be comfortable voting for someone who has those same kind of instincts. So I actually think that was appeal not to black voters, but to white suburbanites, which one of those groups that the president is having a lot of trouble with. I thought Kristen Welker did a great job generally, but particularly on that issue where she presented it as, what do you say to a family, a black family that needs to have what's called the talk with black sons about how you have to be so very careful in situations where where you've been pulled aside for a traffic violation. You have to be careful in a way that white parents just don't have to have that kind of talk with their kids.
Right. Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today. Thank you, as always, for joining us here on States of America.
Hey, Phillip, great to be with you.
It's something to worry about, I think, from the angle of election sort of integrity and how the Americans sort of see the integrity of their elections.
Democrat Joe Biden has had a pretty steady lead in national polls over President Trump. But of course, in the American system, it's really a battle of key states. I'm joined today to talk about three of them with Robert Griffin. He's research director for the Democracy Fund, which is a nonprofit with a goal of strengthening American democracy and does a lot of polling. Let's talk about three key states, about Pennsylvania, always a battleground state, and also about Arizona and Georgia, which have become battleground states this year. Let's compare mail-in voting with in-person voting. What do you find when you look at these three states when it comes to early voting but versus the traditional voting of people going to the polls on election day?
And thanks for having me, Susan. I think the first thing to know about what's going on in these states is that there's a higher number of people who say they're going to vote early, so either early in person or early by mail this year compared to previous elections. That's happening pretty much across the country. Now, that said, there are some significant differences between how these states, how the people in these states are saying that they're going to vote. So in places like Arizona, you have essentially 2/3 of the population saying they're going to vote by mail. In Georgia, it's about a third of people saying they're going to vote in person early, a third of people saying they're going to vote early by mail, and about a third saying they're going to vote in person on election day. And then in Pennsylvania, it's actually still the majority of the state that's saying it's going to vote on election day. Now, this is, again, a rise from previous elections where much more than just a majority of Pennsylvanians said they were going to do so. This year, it's going to be about 52% who are saying it. But it's still a rise, but it's still a very large number of people who are saying in person. In fact, some of the highest in the nation.
You know, it's interesting. A bare majority in Pennsylvania say they're going to vote on election day, go to the polls. Almost two-thirds in Arizona say they're going to vote early by mail. Does one side or the other get an advantage depending on how voters cast their ballots?
So it's not clear that there's a super big advantage here. Previous political science research on this suggests that different administrations, right, how you would potentially vote, doesn't too much change the composition of the electorate. I think the real thing to keep our eye on this election cycle when we think about just how this might play out is that we might see some results on election night, depending on the state, that just don't line up with the final results, right? So Pennsylvania is actually a key example. This is a state that doesn't have experience among the voters with actually voting by mail, so they don't know some of the norms and the customs there. Among election administration officials, they don't have experience necessarily counting this number of ballots, so that we could expect some of the results in Pennsylvania to just be coming in at a bit of a snail's pace relative to other states. And that might have, because supporters of Joe Biden are so much likelier to say they're going to vote by mail, just mean that it appears that Donald Trump might be doing better in Pennsylvania than he actually is for maybe even a day or two.
You know, as you say, this is different from previous elections. The U.S. Election Project reports that almost 34 million Americans have already cast their ballots. We've never seen numbers like that. And I wonder if the risk is where there's this disparity between Republicans tending to vote in person on election day, while Democrats are much more likely to have cast mail-in ballots and absentee ballots. If this might undermine trust in the results, if voters say, look at that early return from in-person voting where Trump did so well, and Biden's catching up with mail-in voting, maybe something's wrong. Do you worry about that?
I do worry about that, right? You know, I think at the end of the day, the important message to walk away with is that all of these methods of voting are sound. They've been practiced in the United States for a really long time, and there's really no reason to think that any of them are going to lead to illegitimate outcomes. But when it's the case that you have some results just sort of looking like they're changing over time, like giving that appearance of it, even though it's just sort of ballots being counted at a slower rate, it's something to worry about, I think, from the angle of election sort of integrity and how the Americans sort of see the integrity of their elections.
Here's something else you looked at in these key states, and that was how voters viewed the two candidates and who they thought had more empathy. How did you try to measure perceptions of the candidates when it came to empathy?
So one of the questions we asked in our survey, Nationscape, which interviews about 6,000 people every week, is we started to ask people whether certain types of statements describe the candidates. And two of the statements that we asked about was to say that they cared about people who had been sick with COVID-19, or if they cared about people who had lost their job. So we think this taps into essentially how voters think about these candidates being empathetic towards two of the big features of this 2020 election. Again, people facing some of the effects of the COVID-19 recession, as well as people facing the direct health effects of COVID-19. So what we found was that pretty much across the board, Joe Biden is just seen as a more empathetic candidate. So it's not 100% clear exactly why this is happening. It could be features of Joe Biden himself, his own personal history, his history as a politician. It could also be features of Donald Trump, who has sort of made his brand as a hard-nosed, take no prisoners business person, right? So it's a little unclear where it's coming from, but the gap is one, rather extraordinary on these two issues that seem to be some of the defining issues of the 2020 election.
You know, the gap is really big in Arizona and Pennsylvania, but there isn't really a gap in Georgia. I was surprised to see that the two candidates, when it came to, does this characteristic describe them very well, Joe Biden and Donald Trump fared about the same. Why would Georgia be different from the other states?
So in some places, when we start to look at this on a state-by-state level, this does correlate with the partisanship of the state, right? So states that are more Republican-leaning, they're going to be a little bit more likely to say that Donald Trump does care and that Joe Biden does not. And places that are more Democratic-leaning are more likely to say the opposite. So some of this is going to be accounted for just by the fact that, some of these states are just have different political compositions going on under the hood. But even that said, if you kind of expand that out to people who aren't just sort of think this describes them very well, but also describes them somewhat well, Joe Biden, once again, has just a little bit of a slight edge. And in a place like Georgia, which has a history of being deeply Republican, I think that's got to be a bad sign for the Trump campaign.
Yeah, just the fact that we're talking about Georgia is a bad sign for the Trump campaign, given its history of voting for Republicans. President Trump has many strengths as a leader. Empathy has never been a characteristic closely associated with him. And yet he won the election 4 years ago. And I wonder, does empathy matter more this year because the country is going through this pandemic and all the economic devastation that has followed?
I think that is very likely, right? So in any given election cycle, the salience of certain types of issues, of certain sort of candidate characteristics are going to just be more or less important. And this cycle, I think what we're hearing a lot from people, both by the focus on COVID-19 and the focus on the economic fallout from the recession that resulted from the COVID-19 lockdown, is that people are asking for candidates to be empathetic. They're asking for candidates who care about this and will do something about it. And I think when you start to poke under the hood and you start to ask people, who do you trust more to handle the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States? Again, Joe Biden comes out ahead with these numbers. I think it's just an election that we're much more likely to see empathy on the ballot. And in this case, they see Joe Biden as the candidate that represents that.
Empathy on the ballot. Hey, Robert Griffin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Here on States of America, we're all about the issues that matter most to you. So we asked what issues you felt the candidates haven't addressed that much. Janet Dunmeyer wanted to know about LGBTQ rights and protections, and specifically how the next administration will ensure the Supreme Court protects the most vulnerable. Janet, first let's take a look at where the candidates stand on this. President Trump. He reworked the policies about transgender people in the military to essentially ban them from serving. He got rid of language protecting LGBTQ kids that participate in 4-H programs at schools. His administration argued the Supreme Court that the Civil Rights Act didn't cover LGBTQ plus citizens in the workplace. Now, the Supreme Court disagreed, and this summer affirmed civil rights protections for LGBTQ plus people. But his administration also worked to donate expensive medication to Americans at high risk of contracting HIV. It will be free of charge through the end of 2025. Now let's frisk former Vice President Joe Biden's record. He says he will support the Equality Act during his first 100 days in office. That would guarantee LGBTQ plus Americans are protected under existing civil rights laws. He also says he reversed the ban on transgender people serving in the military. Janet, as far as your question about how the next administration will ensure the Supreme Court protects LGBTQ rights, well, that lies solely with the court. But each candidate would nominate justices to fill open positions. President Trump's nominees so far have been conservative, but the court has ruled in favor of some LGBTQ rights. Biden's nominees presumably would lean towards his LGBTQ-friendly platform. Thanks for the questions and keep them coming.
Overall, we're still a red state. And it's really hard for Democrats to make up the ground that they've lost over the last decade.
So we're here in downtown Nashville talking with Natalie Allison, politics reporter for the Tennessean, about the debate in Tennessee politics in the era of Donald Trump. Tell me the story again about this bridge.
Yeah, so it's named after John Siegenthaler. He was a longtime Tennessean editor. So the story goes, as I understand, that there was an individual who was threatening to jump off the bridge to take his life. Siegenthaler heard about that, and he raced down here. The Tennessean office was just up Broadway, and he raced down here, and as I understand it, he beat the police, and he was able to talk the guy off the bridge, and decades later it was named after him. Yeah.
Talk about advocacy journalism. Okay.
Sure.
Now, the second and final presidential debate is going to be at Belmont University. First of all, let me ask, what does it mean for the city, I guess, of Nashville, but also why do you think universities like Belmont, in Kentucky, Center College was picked twice for a vice presidential debate. Why are universities like Belmont picked for these sort of presidential debates? How did they get picked?
Well, especially in a year like 2020 when there's not a lot going on, it's something for a city to get to have a presidential debate, something where everyone who's stuck at home, who's watching this, is tuning in, who's hearing about Nashville, who's seeing shots of Nashville. So that's something. it's not what it was before. It's not going to bring the number of reporters, the number of onlookers, the number of audience members that it would have, say, back in 2008 when Nashville did this last time. But it's still something, and it's something that Belmont is really proud of and that they've put a lot of work into.
Part of me thinks that it's that the appeal of a big red state like Tennessee, but a blue city like Nashville. President Trump has had some contentious relationships with senators from Tennessee, Bob Corker, Lamar Alexander. What do conservatives think? Is it still sort of a red rock conservative state for President Trump, or are we seeing his number from 2016 maybe dip a little bit?
Tennessee is still a state that backs President Trump. It is still a deep red state. Again, that wasn't exactly the case in 2008, but where we've come since then is that this is a state that is ruled by Republicans. It is full of conservatives. Whereas you mentioned Corker and Alexander had at times butted heads with President Trump, our current junior, soon-to-be senior senator now, Marsha Blackburn, is one of Trump's most loyal supporters in the Senate. And then if Trump wins re-election, Bill Hagerty, who is the Republican nominee in our U.S. Senate race to replace Alexander, who's seen as the likely winner of that election, has also pledged his support to Donald Trump.
So there's no sort of waning support for President Trump in Tennessee at all. It's still sort of this red rock place for him, conservative and politically speaking.
I mean, as the Republican Party is working out what it's going through with what happens in a post-Trump world if Trump doesn't win, I think there could be some Republicans in Tennessee who maybe weren't quite on board with Trump back in 2016 in the primary, who will conveniently forget the last 4 years and their devotion to Trump. But overall, yeah, this is a conservative state. This is not a state where Democrats are really competitive. And in some places they are. In Nashville, of course, in our biggest cities, in Memphis and Knoxville, those are still Democratic strongholds. But overall, we're still a red state, and it's really hard for Democrats to make up the ground that they've lost over the last decade.
What are the issues that folks in Tennessee want to hear about? Is it health care? Is it gun rights? Abortion? We just saw like a plane fly over downtown Nashville advocating against abortion, and we obviously know that Judge Amy Coney Barrett is this close to being on the Supreme Court. What is it that Tennessee residents, whether in your blue cities or rural parts, exurbs, suburbs, more conservative leaning folks, what do they want to hear Joe Biden and President Trump talk about?
Well, yeah, you're right. There is a plane flying overhead that says vote anti-abortion, and Tennessee is an anti-abortion state overall. If you look at the laws that our legislature are passing just this year, the governor signed into law a very controversial fetal heartbeat bill that's already being challenged in court, and it's their goal is to hopefully get that up to the Supreme Court. So a Supreme Court that would be able to strike down, in some case, Roe versus Wade would be something that the Tennessee legislature would really applaud, and they've pushed laws through that would automatically outlaw abortion in the state if that happens at the Supreme Court level. So yeah, that's something that Tennessee cares about. At least Republicans in this state who've elected Republican supermajority in the legislature. But on the topic of health care, Medicaid expansion, that's not a federal issue, that's a state issue, but that is something that is wildly popular in the state, even though the Republican legislature has declined to pass. So I think people who are looking for more health care options, more help from the government in that, would be interested in hearing that from the presidential candidates. But again, that is an issue that's ultimately going to come down to how the state decides to move forward.
How has COVID-19 affected Tennessee, both culturally, socially, politically, and early voting, or how is the vote looking like it's going in Tennessee as far as who's participating more, who's more energized?
On the topic of the election and how that's going so far, the Secretary of State in Tennessee just announced today that early voting is up, I think, around 47% this year compared to the last presidential election. I just saw that pop up in my inbox, so I hope I have that stat right. But over 1 million people have voted so far early in Tennessee. So that's huge, but that's what we're seeing around the country, that people, be it COVID or just uncertainty about ballots being counted in general, are getting out to the polls early. They're submitting getting absentee ballots. In Tennessee, we have faced multiple lawsuits over the state's resistance to expanding absentee voting. Ultimately, the Secretary of State's office did have to come around and allow anyone who wants to request an absentee ballot this year to be able to do that, but that took the court's ruling in the favor of the people who were challenging Tennessee's current laws.
Natalie Allison, thank you as always for joining us here on States of America with your perspective on Tennessee politics.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Phil, and welcome to Nashville.
Hell yeah.
And that just clicked with him. He said, well, how much would that cost me?
Belmont University is hosting its second presidential debate. This comes 12 years after it hosted its first debate between Senators Barack Obama and John McCain in 2008. We talked with University President Dr. Robert Fisher about Belmont's place in presidential election history.
We were founded in 1890. That tower was here since 1860, I think. It was a water tower for a home on the estate. We have this year 8,200 plus students on campus. Back in 2008, we had about 5,000. So we've grown considerably since that first debate. Belmont's I always like to say it's a small town in a pretty big city in Nashville, and I love small towns. We have, when we built the Curb Event Center, which is right there behind me, in fact, it was almost on this spot that Mike Curb and I walked down here. The first time I met him, we walked down and we stopped right over there, and there was a parking lot there and an old gym over there. And he said, what's your first project at Belmont? And I said, we're going to build an event center. And he said, okay, tell me about it. And I said, well, just imagine this, Mike, from the Curb Event Center, a guy comes on and says, good. And Mike had been the lieutenant governor of California, but he's a record executive, owns his record company. But imagine, Mike, a guy comes on and says, good evening, this is Jim Malera from the Curb Event Center at Belmont University. We bring you the third and pivotal presidential debate. And that just clicked with him. He said, well, how much would that cost me? And then we worked out a deal, and he made a huge donation, and we built this $55 million project, which was our very first thing to get the ball rolling here. So I had to get a debate. So I went to work immediately, and by 2008, we were able to bring one here. And ever since then, we've been great partners with the Commission on Presidential Debates. A year ago, when we were selected for this, who would have thought that things would be the way they are today? But that's kind of what partnerships are all about, for better or for worse. That's what marriages are about. And partnerships are about, are you there for me when I really need you? And we're there for them, and they're there for us. And this is going to be a great debate, and both of us have hung in there. And I think it's going to prove to be a critical moment in our history. It's different, but again, it's kind of like life. A lot of things happen to me in life I didn't sign up for either, but I get them. And so I think our existence is defined not by what happens to us, but how we respond to it. And so we're all in, and I think we're going to be blessed.
All right, everyone, thanks for joining us on States of America, where we have honest conversations on the issues that matter most.